Hi everyone. So today I want to talk about what to do when your houseplants get too big, because I'm sure you've all been there. We buy those plants that are super cute in the store when they're small, and then a year or two go by and all of a sudden we're like, what the heck happened? This plant is way too big. It is taking up way too much of my space. I got to do something about it. So today we're going to be taking a look at 9 different things you can do to resolve the issue of having a plant that has just gotten way too big for your space. And we are going to be looking at this in order of what I guess I would call the least drastic measures that you can take up to the most drastic measures that you can take. And one of the last things that we're going to be talking about today actually is a little bit controversial, and I'll explain what I mean when we get to that suggestion. But first of all, one of you guys had actually commented that you found out the hard way that plants get really big because your Monstera got massive and started taking up too much space in the room that it was in, and your solution to that problem was just to make that room what you now call the Monstera room. So basically dedicating a room to your large oversized plant. While this is 100% an option, and perhaps even you could dedicate a room to all of your oversized plants, just put them in one plant, make it a plant room, totally a valid decision. However, you guys, for a lot of us, that is really just not a practical option. So my first suggestion for when you have a houseplant that has gotten too big, depending on what type of plant it is, because not all of these suggestions will work for every type of plant, but of course the number one thing you can do is simply prune your plant back. So once again, just a quick reminder that if you are pruning that plant back, you don't want to take it back more than a third of the plant at a time, but it is definitely a great option to kind of tame a plant down, take down the height of the plant, take down the width of the plant, and kind of get it to fit your space a little bit better. Now, another thing you want to take into consideration if you are pruning back a plant, you want to make sure that that plant's not already severely root bound, because if it is severely root bound, you're going to need to be repotting it anyway, and that is probably one of the biggest problems when we have plants that have gotten too large. When they get root bound, now we need to take them up another pot size. That's going to take up more space. It's going to be even more of a problem if we are limited on space and that plant is already being a complete and total space hog. So really, pruning back the plant is not necessarily the best solution if that plant is root bound and about to need to be repotted anyway. I would really just stick to pruning plants that aren't root bound and aren't going to need to be repotted into bigger pots anytime soon. But that is definitely a valid option to deal with a plant that is getting too big for you. Now, another thing you can do if it is a plant that is kind of growing way outwards, or it's stretching out, or it's kind of flopping, all over the place, and it's just taking up a ton of horizontal space for that reason, and you don't have room for it to be taking up that much horizontal space, but you do have room for it to be taking up more vertical space, is to just simply try and tame the plant. So some ways we can tame plants are by staking up branches and vines. You can also kind of bind and tie branches or vines together to get it into a more upright appearance. That is definitely something that you can do. Once again, this is not something that's going to work for all plants. You need plants that have flexible branches and vines. You don't want to accidentally snap anything in the process of doing this, but it is an option for some plants. Now, another option, and this is something you might not have thought about before, but if you do have a plant that is taking up a bunch of horizontal space, so for example, an upright philodendron comes to mind, if you really just need to save a little bit of space, if it's just a little bit too big, you could always consider changing the type of planter you have it in to a tilted planter. So basically a tilted planter, instead of having the opening directly on the top of the pot, it is angled at the side. So by putting that plant in there, that helps us resolve some of the horizontal space that it is taking up and make it a little bit more vertical. Actually, it can make the plant kind of look more beautiful in my opinion too, because now you're able to kind of see that plant a little bit better. It's shown off a little bit more. Obviously, if you are going to do a tilted planter, and let's say you're doing a cover pot situation like I normally do, just make sure that the soil level in the pot that the plant is in is not too high to where when you do put it in there, all that soil is going to fall out. But definitely an excellent option to help save a little bit of space. Now, another thing you can do that sometimes people forget is you can hang the plant. So for example, if you have a syngonium that has just gotten way, way, way too big, it's taking up way too much space on the floor or on a plant stand in your home, you can change that to be a hanging plant, hang it from the ceiling somewhere. And typically we don't have like as big of a space restraint when we talk about the space that is above our heads. Now, if you have super low ceilings and, kind of small rooms, maybe that's not going to work for you, but it's definitely something to consider. You can also use plant rings to put plants on the wall to get them kind of out of the way a little bit. Just something to keep in mind. Now, those are the least drastic measures that you can take to resolve a plant that has just gotten way too big for you. Moving into some of the more drastic measures, if it is a plant that can be divided when you're repotting it, I would definitely consider dividing it. So basically, when you're repotting that plant, what you would want to do is just make a nice clean cut with a very sharp, sterile knife. Try to avoid cutting through any tubers or bulbs or anything like that that may be in the soil of that plant. But basically, you're just going to divide that plant into as many smaller plants as you want and at the size that you would like them to be. So then you're just basically going to keep one of those for yourself. You can take the other ones and either gift them out to friends and family, or maybe list them for sale on Facebook, whatever it may be, and now you're back to having that plant at a more manageable size. Now, if it's not a plant that can be propagated via division when you're repotting it, you can also just propagate the plant either in water or directly into soil and just start over from scratch. So I could do this, for example, with my Begonia maculata that has gotten very large. If it was kind of at the point where I thought it was too big and I just couldn't handle it anymore, it's very easy to just take a propagation, put it in water, let it root, pot it back up in a pot, let it start growing again from a smaller plant. And with that plant in particular, it's not going to take very long for that to happen. So in that situation, once again, once you have gotten that new plant established at that size that you want it, what you can do is simply gift the original plant that has gotten too large for you to somebody you know, or once again, list it for sale online or whatever it may be. But the next thing you can do to deal with a plant that has gotten too large for you is the one that I think is going to be a little bit controversial. Some of you might have heard of this before. Some of you might not have heard of this before. Some of you are probably going to cringe and go, eek, no, when I tell you this, but just hear me out. There is something called root pruning that you can do to your plants. Now, I know I have told you before, don't mess with the roots, but even if you were doing what we talked about earlier, which is dividing the plant while you're repotting it, you're going to have to cut through the roots. Now, I've always said if you are cutting through roots, make sure you're doing a quick clean cut and not like hacking the roots up basically. But root pruning is something that has been done for decades. It is well documented in a lot of plant literature. There are people out there who have been doing it successfully for years and years and years. So there is no reason for you to be totally just scared of root pruning. Now, if you are terrified of this, that you don't have to do it. I've given you other options here. But if you are interested in root pruning your plant, the first thing you need to know is, just like when we're pruning the part of the plant that is above the soil surface, we don't take off more than a third. Same thing applies for if we're pruning below the surface. You don't want to remove more than a third of the roots at a time. But basically what you're going to do is, once you have a very root-bound plant, you're going to take it out of its pot. You're going to take a nice, sharp, clean, sterile knife of sorts. I do highly recommend using a knife versus scissors for this, you guys, because once again, I want your goal to be to make as few cuts as possible, as cleanly as possible. So what you're going to do is you're going to start by cutting off the lower third portion of the roots. From here, if you would like, you can actually go ahead and repot that plant, just having removed that lower third portion of the roots back into the same size pot with some new soil in the bottom of that pot. However, it might be more beneficial and you wouldn't have to repot again as soon if you also cut some of the roots off of the side of that plant as well. So once again, our goal though is not to remove more than a third of the roots at any given time. But by doing this, we have now allowed this plant to stay at this size and remain in this same size pot. And once again, when you are doing this, try to avoid cutting through any tubers or bulbs or anything like that that might be in that soil. If you do accidentally cut through one, it's not like a huge deal, but you might want to remove, especially if it's like a tuber like you would see in like a calathea, you might want to remove it where it connects to the plant, just so you don't have that wide open space of that tuber to potentially like rot. Now, do be aware that you will probably experience a little bit of signs of shock in your plant after doing root pruning. That is 100% normal. You might see some leaf loss over the immediate days following that. Definitely just make sure that that plant is well watered, assuming that it didn't need to be watered when you did the root pruning, and make sure it's getting a decent amount of light. If it is a plant that you normally have living in a lower light situation, try giving it a little bit more light after you do that so that it is encouraged to reproduce and regrow those new roots more quickly. But it will bounce back. In a lot of cases, the plant will actually start to grow in more lush and more full than it was before, because when plants are severely root bound, they tend to start to decline. So we're really giving the plant a refresher when we're doing this. Now, once again, This may not be for everybody. It may be entirely nerve-wracking for you. Just thinking about it or watching this might be causing you some stress. If that is the case, that's totally fine. Do one of the other things I'm talking about in this video. But I'm just curious, how many of you out there have done root pruning before, have been doing it for a long time, even maybe? If you have, please comment down below and kind of let everybody know your experiences. So maybe that will help everybody be a little bit more relaxed and at ease with potentially trying this with their plants. But at the end of the day, you guys, you may find yourself in a situation where you need to rehome, gift, or sell that plant just as it is to somebody who has more space for that plant, and never feel guilty if you find yourself in that situation. Now, you can also consider replacing that plant with a plant that will actually stay smaller just naturally on its own. And if you need some ideas of space-saving plants like that, definitely check out this video next. Thank you so much for joining me today, you guys, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Aloha!